Hey everyone, how you guys doing today? Moving on with an itch in my beard. Okay, moving on with Fast API today. We're, we spoke about this yesterday, but we're going to continue on with the response model return type. We're just going to go through this and extra models, these two pages right here. Um, this page is actually kind of useful. I felt like the last 4 or 5 pages, the ones I grouped together into the last video, were like kind of like eh. Um, but this starts off pretty simple, saying that in type annotations you can also define the return type, which they didn't talk about, and the same kind of validation and editing support is given to you even here. There's a phrase here: most importantly, limit and filter the output data to that which is defined in the return type. Particularly important for security, which I was like, what? What does that mean? But then it made a lot more sense today, and also made the response model parameter make more sense. So here, first they defined like, okay, you use the response model parameter essentially when you're returning something else, right? And instead of that, but also you still want the OpenAPI schema to generate this, etc., etc. Right? Pretty straightforward so far, but it's like, why would you do that? Um, and also, you have to note that this is I mean, that's what they're noting right here, is that this is part of the decorator method, the response model parameter, I mean. So, if you declare both a return type and a response model, the response model will take priority in terms of how the validation is conducted. I'm like, okay, fairly, I mean, it makes sense, because otherwise, what would be the point of it? But I still wasn't seeing the point of it until we got into this example, right? So, this is essentially an example with this class user in, and it has a password, and this is just a basic definition, and definitely do not do this in production. A little bit of info on a package called email validator, but we're not going to get into that. But essentially we'll need it for the email string type. They're stored to the plain password of a user or send it in a response like this, for sure. Definitely don't do that. Adding an output model. See, this is where it becomes really handy, right? Along with the combo of response model, where now you have a separate model user out, right, from user in, and essentially you just want to modify. In this case, you're just returning it as is, but if you were to modify it and then return it, right, you can do that. And because you set the response type to user out, even though the return object is literally user in, it will automatically be like, oh, we're supposed to be returning user out, so whatever the password is, we're just going to toss that before we send the response. That is where the value is of using something like this. But there are other ways around it as well, which they get into, basically tying to user inheritance. Um, see, it's defining where to use response model versus just annotating the return type in this paragraph right here. And it says continue reading to see how you overcome that. And essentially, how you overcome that is with inheritance. So, for example, if you created a base user class that inherited from base model, and then you had a user in class which had, a user out class which had all this, that inherited from the base user class, and then a user in class that inherited from all of this, that had the password parameter or field, whatever you want to call it. Um, that is when you can define the output to be of type base user, and since the other two are subclasses of base user, it will accept it even though it's technically not the same class, and you'll get all the editing support and everything like that. So this is what I mean. This is an exact example of what I mean. Here they just created a class base user, and they created a new class user in that inherits from base user, and just added this additional parameter of password. So it takes in user in and returns base user, and even though this is actually an object of user in, since the return type is base user, it gets coerced by Fast API pretty automatically. So that's really neat, actually. That's really helpful. Really keeps code nice and clean. Or all right, that's the name of the video. I sneezed. So I'm just gonna skip all this. It's just generic boilerplate talk about how this works, why it's acceptable, because essentially base user has the base fields, user inherits from base user and adds the password field. We annotate the return function type as base user, but we are actually returning a user in instance. The editor, MyPy, and other tools won't complain about this because in typing terms, user in is a subclass of base user, which means it's a val type when what is expected is anything that is a base user. There you go. And that's just a further detailing of what I described just now. And because you do this, Fast API will do the filtering as well. See it in the docs. These are just a couple of screenshots of the Swagger. Other return type annotations. So you can return a response type directly. So Fast API has response objects, which apparently we'll get into more in the advanced docs. By default, Fast API would automatically convert that return value to a JSON using the JSONable encoder explained in JSON compatible encoder. Then behind the scenes, it will put that JSON compatible data, example a dict, inside of a JSON response that would be used to send that response to the client. Okie dokie. So either way, you just, in this case, is just a further showcase of response. You're actually returning a redirect response or JSON response, since both of those are subclasses of response, it totally works fine. So I don't know what it's saying. You can also use subclass of response in the type annotation. Oh, okay, this is just an example that's being. Sometimes it's weird. It's a little oddly thorough at times, but then like the cookie parameters is like, here's cookies. Anyways, invalid return type annotations. So apparently the union method fails because the type annotation is not a pydantic type and is not just a single response class. So for some reason, if you return an arbitrary object that is not a valid pydantic type and you annotate it like that in the function, Fast API will try to create a pydantic response model from that type annotation and will fail. So that's why this is fine on its own, because this can be coerced into a pydantic model, but this cannot. So the whole thing, this can as well as other types, but the combo cannot. So that's why that is. You can, in this case, continuing from the example above, you might want to have the default data validation documentation set at this point, but you might want to still keep the return type annotation in the function to get support from tools like editors. In this case, you can see. So you can just set response model equals none, and then it just won't bother generating a pydantic model in the back end. See? without it affecting your fast API application. See, yeah, so that's pretty straightforward. I don't think that's a particularly safe or smart thing to do unless you really understand what you're doing, but fair enough. Response model encoding parameters. So essentially, here they're going to talk about response model exclude unset and response model include unset, wherein basically in your Pydantic model, if you have default values set, if they are if you give this parameter true, response model exclude unset equals true, even though there are default values put in for tags, taxes, and description. If they are not set, for example, in the foo class, then the response object will just have that and not produce the unset but default available values. So ignore this bit about .dict and .model dump. That's really only relevant in the next page. I think there might have been a piece of it that they had here that they broke up recently or something like that. So you can also, yeah, you can also use these. I'm not getting into that right now. We're just gonna keep moving on because I'm just gonna go through this page and end it. So yeah, default values, that's useful in certain situations where it doesn't need to be idempotent per se, like if the schema or the shape of the response body changes, that's okay. You can also just set response model include and exclude to include and exclude specific items from a class. So similar to like the earlier example with the users and stuff like that, we could have just had one user model and we could have set response model exclude password for certain functions. And this essentially needs to take a set, right? Because it needs to be unique, obviously, this response model include and response model exclude parameter. But if you give it a tuple or a list, it'll just coerce it. It's totally fine. So that is that. We are good. That's pretty much the end of this episode. And I technically read one more page, and there's some useful stuff here as well. But I'm just going to hold off on that and come back to it tomorrow. Just because that's basically the only thing I managed to do. My sister's kids are in town. They're taking up a lot of my time. They're precious little ones. I love them. So, yeah, time has been a bit difficult for me. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.